Right, I think we may as well start. Today we're going to focus on TSYS and the partnership with Prove. It's something that we don't talk about enough. But what this is about providing an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to disrupt the payments landscape and support customer authentication verification in new ways. So let me start. So I'm just going to start by giving a bit of an overview as to Prove, some of our capabilities and how we fit with TSYS before handing off to Salil and the panel. You should find the panel very interesting. This is more of a kind of starter, as I often say, just to get people used to the idea as to Prove and TSYS working together. So back in 2019, we signed a partnership with TSYS. In fact, we did a press release. That was centered on our integration with the TSYS Authentication platform. And so part of that ecosystem that's centered on risk scoring and helping to understand whether payments can fundamentally be processed or not. Now, this has been a fruitful partnership for both parties. However, there has been some changes recently, which is going to enable a deeper level of collaboration. And this is where we start to talk about new opportunities and new ways of disruption. As we move forward, I also want to emphasize that I will talk a little bit about Prove separately as well, just again, so you can get an understanding. But I also want to talk about some capabilities that are now taking hold in the UK and beyond, and some examples of where they've improved customer experience and risk appetite. So first and foremost, just a little bit on the Prove concept, and I'll keep this short and sweet. So if you think of it as fundamentally, phone numbers are becoming the modern way of identifying customers. So what this does is it enables us to provide a multitude of capabilities to support businesses all the way from onboarding, so the first time you see a customer, through to payments and product applications. Obviously today, a lot of what we'll discuss with TSYS being a payments platform will be talking about the payment process itself, risk and authentication. However, we are finding that our capabilities are leveraged in multiple ways in multiple geographies. So taking that initial concept, I'm just going to break it into two. So we have kind of two overarching concepts based on the phone number. So if you think of it as being, first and foremost, pre-filling. So that isn't necessarily 100% relevant for today, but it gives you an idea as to where we can leverage a phone number to be able to onboard a customer very quickly, entering their details automatically as a result of proving possession and ownership of the device. But today, what I want to do is focus more on our phone identity network. So if you think of the idea of tokenizing understanding against phone numbers, so thus enabling things like peer-to-peer payments, e-commerce, and other elements that can be leveraged as part of ecosystems such as TSYS. And that's based on what we have as our kind of overarching three pillars. So I've mentioned this before on other webinars, but I think it's key to kind of get this across before we get to the panel. So we have a standard that we call Pro. So Pro is broken down into possession, reputation, and ownership. So from a possession standpoint, that can be anything from traditional SMS or voice OTP through to mobile authentication, which we touched on before. These elements are all live and operational, as I've mentioned. However, what's happening here is that from a possession standpoint, it's giving us options now, and this is where the disruption element comes in. So instead of just focusing on providing something that may be a service or a system that's quite frictionful, we can remove that friction by leveraging our integrations with our partners on our platform itself to provide insight into possession. We then have reputation, which can be applied to all use cases, but this is fundamentally where TSYS are leveraging the Prove capabilities today. So if you think of it as being, and this is massively kind of, if anything, dumbing it down, but if you think of the risk associated to the number prior to, say, for example, a step-up SMS OTP. So what we're doing is we're enabling the payments landscape and others to tick that PSD2 SCA regulatory box, whilst also providing a kind of risk understanding. So if I just go back to this slide, so if you think of it, possession, reputation, and ownership, the TSYS element is very much at the moment focused on that possession and reputational side. Then that leads to, just so a little bit more detail without going into too much depth. So to be able to do what we need to do as part of this ecosystem, We rely on a multitude of different kind of data sets and different integrations that we have behind the scenes. This all leads to us then creating our identity network. So quite often Prove are associated with telco only, when the reality is that we actually have insights from a number of angles, whether it's an historical angle or whether it's via one of our other partners. And then just to kind of set the scene, so when you consider those propositions, TSYS being one of our main partners, but actually this is something that is regarded as being embryonic, but is actually trusted by a multitude of different brands. So you can see a number of the brands that's on the screen there today. There are many more. We're now live in 1,000 enterprises, 500 plus banks, and there are new banks and new other financial services organizations that are taking our capability almost on a kind of weekly basis. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Salil so he can introduce the panel and discuss the opportunity that we have to leverage Prove's capabilities and integrate them deeply within TSYS. Thanks, Salil.
Thank you, Kieran. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this live webinar hosted by Medici in partnership with Prove. Thank you for joining this virtual discussion. My name is Salil Ravindran and I lead the research and advisory practice at Medici. And I will be moderating this discussion for the next 40 minutes or so. We have a number of people who are joining us from different parts of the world today for this webinar. And we have a great lineup of speakers as well. So please do stay with us until the end of the hour. It's going to be a very informative session. So this is the last of a series of 3 webinars in a specific context that Medici and Prove has been doing. And it's about the changing landscape of digital identity and identity verification, specifically in the context of UK and Europe, where strong customer authentication is now live since the beginning of the year. At least in Europe, UK, there's still a little bit more time to go for it to go live. But barring UK and France, every other country in the European Union is supposed to be compliant with strong customer authentication as of now. So now we are not going to get into the nitty-gritties of PSD2 and SCA because that's very well understood by everyone by now. But I do want to bring your attention to some statistics that I was looking at in this context, specifically in the context of cyber fraud and strong customer authentication. At a very fundamental level is looking at strengthening security for payments. So that is why probably it's a little bit important to look at these statistics. So if you look at purely identity-related frauds, just since the onset of COVID in UK alone, that fraud, identity fraud alone has quadrupled. So there's a 4x increase since the month of January 2020. Since the onset of COVID, purely around identity-related frauds. The estimate is that there's close to almost 10 million pounds of financial loss in the UK alone on account of SIM swapping, something which was not really very much heard of, 7 to 8 years back in the European and the UK regions. But there's been a tremendous increase, a significant increase in SIM swapping alone in the last 2 years specifically. So these are all numbers that are being reported by Action Fraud in the UK. So these are very reliable numbers and this is real. And if you look at some specific instances in January 2020, the Spanish police along with the Europol, they actually cracked down on a huge SIM swap racket. And by the time they were taken, almost 3 million euros was stolen across different customers, across the region, across Italy, France, Spain, and a whole lot of other countries. So across the region, close to 3 million euros was stolen in about 150 instances of SIM swap. Now, SIM swap is, just one such case of identity takeover. Identity fraud, but clearly there's been a significant increase in identity fraud in general in Europe in the last few years. So on one side, SCA is actually trying to address some of these security concerns. But in today's discussion, that's exactly what we're going to look at. Firstly, we're going to look at the existing authentication and identity verification mechanisms, and that includes MFA. And we're going to look at, is that good enough to really dispel these kind of sophisticated threats, such as synthetic identity related frauds and so on. And if not, how differently should it be approached? So that's part one of what we're going to look at in this discussion. Secondly, we're going to look at, given the fact that identity verification really needs to be strengthened for SCA compliance, how can you ensure as an organization, be it a bank or a merchant, how can you make sure that this is not really intrusive from a customer experience standpoint? Because there are genuine apprehensions around customer application abandonment, payment abandonment, and so on. And at the end of the day, finally, for all the investment that banks are doing and different organizations are doing, how can they actually take it up a little bit more strategically? How can they actually convert some of these investments into something more strategic than looking at this from a very tactical standpoint just to ensure compliance? So to discuss all of this, I'm extremely happy to introduce to you three very seasoned experts from the world of digital identity for this panel discussion. Daniel Jean from TSYS, Ravi Bijlani, and Nash from Prove. So Daniel is the Director of Product Management at TSYS, and he manages the entire portfolio of products that includes the global authentication platform that provides a risk-based approach to strong customer authentication. Daniel has spent more than 23 years in the industry, and he has previously held leadership positions in product management and product marketing at Equifax and AT&T. Ravi is the Senior Vice President and General Manager for International Business at Prove. Ravi has spent more than 22 years in various roles across sales, alliances, strategy, and product development. Prior to Prove, Ravi held leadership roles at Equifax and TSYS. And finally, Nash is the head of strategy for financial services at Prove. Nash is an industry veteran with more than 26 years behind him at various organizations like eBay, Western Union, Bank of America, and Sun Microsystems. And prior to Prove, Nash was leading risk and strategy for MoneyGram's digital global businesses. Daniel, Ravi, and Nash, a very warm welcome to this discussion. Let me start with you, Daniel. Am I audible? Can one of you confirm?
Yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. So let me start with you, Daniel. Coming to you, let's start by looking at some of the basics around this. Like I said, identity authentication and identity verification, it's been around in various forms, and it has evolved over the years, in different ways. So let me break my question into two parts. Part one of the question is, if you look at the evolution of customer identity verification and where we stand right now, what are the limitations and constraints that we have with the approaches that you see today? And that includes, multi-factor authentication, something that SCA strongly advocates. That's part one of the question. Is that good enough right now? If not, if you were to look at it in a different way, with a different approach, what are the new dimensions that should go into modern digital identity? What are the new data sources? What is new about this modern approach, and why are they critical, and what are the drivers behind this change? If you could start off explaining some of these things.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me today. I'm really, our partnership with Prove has been really great for our clients. So I'm so happy to be here. It wasn't that long ago, frankly, you talk about authentication, where knowledge-based authentication was, one of the really key weapons you had. In fact, it was one of my early products that I managed, and it was really nice back in the day. But obviously, right when you consider breaches in social media, it's not as effective as it used to be. And frankly, even when it was, the data was effective there, the user experience wasn't all that good. You're getting questions, they had to be tough questions that you couldn't answer easily. And so you end up having to look up things. It was really, really a poor user experience, but it was about the only thing that was there. And so, the industry kind of looked at, well, what can we do better than that? And of course, that's when one-time passcodes really came around, which were a really big step from KBA. And whether it was one-time passcodes via email or SMS, both were really nice because they ended up proving possession of something without those kind of hard tokens. And especially if you're trying to prove possession, if you're trying to authenticate employees, well, that's easy to send out tokens. But when you're trying to handle your customer base, super expensive to send that out. So what a nice little solution that is. Of course, it didn't take long for fraudsters to kind of figure out how to get around that, right? And now all of a sudden, as you talked, there are things like SIM swap attacks and call forwarding, call forwarding pieces. And so, and frankly, and even that, there's this kind of, account takeover, problem that would happen, which is you don't really know who owns the phone, right? You're kind of blindly sending a one-time passcode to the phone. So one thing that at TSYS that we really talk to our clients about is, look, there's still a really big need for one-time passcodes, but we really don't like sending them unless we talk about protected one-time passcodes. And so when you talk about how do you protect a one-time passcode, then we said you have to go and find a record of ownership. What's the system of record for ownership of a phone, and what's the system of record for a device itself? And so, once you can use that to kind of confirm who owns a phone, you can confirm whether a phone's been SIM swapped or call forwarded or any of those things. Now, all of a sudden, that one-time passcode is a lot more effective and a lot safer. And, frankly, in the realm of PSD2, which, I know we're not going to get into it a whole lot, but even PSD2 kind of talks about risk factors and making sure that you're handling risk factors before sending one-time passcodes. And so this is the kind of risk factors that we like to recommend happens before one-time passcode gets sent out. So there's a lot of pros to one-time passcodes. It's fairly fairly ubiquitous, right? I mean, most people have access to either email or SMS nowadays. And so that's a really good way to kind of reach out to the last bit of your cardholders. And then also although the user experience is still a little clunky, right? People are still going to a text message and finding copying and pasting a code and then going back to where they were and pasting it in. From a user experience, I don't kind of love that, but it is a kind of an acceptable means of doing that. People are used to it. They're generally not put off by it. In fact, there's some studies that kind of show there's a little bit of positive turn in some people's mind because it feels like you're protecting something, right? Sometimes if things are a little bit too frictionless, it can be, feel a little unprotected, but generally it's an acceptable action. So then you say, well, how do you improve that even more? And really you kind of move into what, digital spaces, right? And so the first kind of digital space we look at is really going right to app notifications and things like that. And so the kind of positives and the drivers for that is it could be a better interaction. A one-time passcode is just a kind of code going back and forth. You can't have any more interaction about, do I approve this? Do I deny it? Does this look like fraud? It's the interaction between the cardholder and you, isn't quite so good with a one-time passcode. But if you get into kind of app notifications, then you can have a much richer interaction. Now with those, there's still some, we found there's still some issues. First of all, mobile app penetration, we found is generally kind of less than 50% with most of the clients that we talk to. In fact, a lot of clients have less than 25% mobile app penetration from their cardholders. So that's a big swath of your cardholders that you can't access that way. Even though it's a rich interaction, you have to find a way to kind of make sure that you're handling all your cardholders. And so that kind of brings us to the point that we're really looking at right now and implementing right now, and I think it's a really good solution, which is really looking at mobile authentication, and it's also called header enrichment, right? But the idea behind that is, can I interact during my interaction in my phone? Can I confirm the usefulness of that phone and the connection to that phone? Because when you do, that actually proves possession in the background, completely frictionless, and there's no kind of having to do OTPs or anything like that. And in fact, at least for me, when I was going through this, I really talked about it as frictionless OTP, because in essence, that's kind of what it is. It's this confirmation of OTP in the background without the OTP, right? So it's a great user experience. It's completely frictionless, and so I really think that's the way forward on this. And now maybe just the last thing, I know I've spoken a bit, but all these things can work nicely, but you really have to layer them together, right? Because as I talked about, mobile app penetration isn't ubiquitous. Mobile auth, there is certain use cases that it uses, and then you kind of use your OTP to get to the last mile, so to speak, or the last 10 or 20% of your clients, of your cardholders. So you really have to make sure that you're using all these things together to kind of get to your card base.
Wonderful. Ravi, let me come to you. Traditionally, we've had for a number of years now, banks using first-party data sources, right? The information about the customer that's held in the bank, static PII data sources, all of this gets combined to the extent of even analyzing a little bit on the behavioral side of things. So all of this sort of adaptive authentication has existed for a while now. And now we're trying to, using things like 3DS2, we're trying to get a lot more data right from the touch points. And we're trying to add that as well into the mix, before really verifying identity. But my question is, is that still good enough to tackle things like synthetic identities, for example, like the statistics I laid out earlier? Is that really good enough to really take care of all of this? But because it looks like, all of these things still may not be good enough, and something like a synthetic identity can really bypass all of this. Now, how do you really, go about reinforcing this identity even better?
Thanks, Salil. First of all, thanks a lot for having me here. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the participants listening. And so if you, Salil, if you think about it, traditional methods that were established prior, or I should say, that's so 1900s, right? But traditional methods that were used earlier were using some combination of classic security paradigms, right? To measure the appropriate level of assurance for that identity that the consumer that's logging in is saying, is he or she, is that who they are? And the paradigm was primarily around something you have, something you know, and something you are. But if you think about it, like you said, these are all static information, something that you can go and either buy from black market. Fraudsters primarily can go and buy it from black market, or they're easily penetrable, right? So unfortunately, these questions that gets answered are really not good enough to dispel the identity-related fraud, such as synthetic identity, like you mentioned, right? And on top of that, because of use of these traditional methods, they have created something that we call as trust gap, right? But if you ask me, the traditional methods look at a static data, which you said, first party data within banks, and use some static information that does this phone number belong to Ravi? One of the examples that Daniel mentioned was that you send an OTP, right? All those things, at the end of the day, they come and revolve around a phone. The modern approach that I would look at would be that you just show up your phone, and the phone identity will make it very easily for you to prove who you are. And phone really has the power to modernize every aspect of the business. And the other thing is that if you look at how can we stop synthetic identity fraud, or how can we stop any other kind of fraud, it would be really utilizing the three game-changing capabilities of the phone, right? And some of them that Daniel touched on. One was really looking at possession and frictionless possession, which is mobile auth, which is customer comes in and we can frictionlessly or behind the scenes figure out what phone number is active on this device. And then the second part, I think, where I would like to focus more on, which is around the reputation, right? Which is what decides whether you should get access to a particular system or not, or this payment transaction should process or not, or even when you get a one-time passcode and you're entering, is that really who you're, was that one-time passcode really meant for you, right? Which is, around, looking at the phone number tenure, the line of the phone tenure, and then, and the other thing is that how long you've owned that device. That is also a big measurement of really, of trustworthiness per se. And, what I feel like, if you think about it, how many people have mobile phone and how long they've had them and how often they use, it is really gives us a clear signal around, if there's a fraudulent aspect or non-fraudulent transaction, right? And we talked about that the traditional method is to look at static data, but the modern method is to really look at, phone intelligence data and traditional data combined with it to give you a whole well-rounded, measure of identity. But I would say, the last part that I would say is that I think fraudsters are always going to be one step ahead of us. What we have to do is make it expensive for them to do the fraud, right? So and that's what at Prove we have done, which is, if you combine the static data sources and phone intelligence data, it will make it extremely difficult for a fraudster to break it. One, they have to have a phone number, they have to pay for account for years, and then they have to use that phone number every day, right, to make sure that it's active and it's in good standing. So in general, combination of the static data as well as the variable data, which is the phone intelligence data, should help long ways. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but it should definitely help long ways.
Right. No, absolutely. I think, these are very relevant points. As they say, phone number is the new national identifier. And it actually brings out a lot more of a real-time validation as opposed to, doing it in a traditional way, which was more about, handling mostly stale data, if I may be a little bit harsh. Nash, let me come to you. And, this is the concept of digital identity, right? I know that, this kind of has been going around for the past 20 years or so. Probably the earliest instances I can remember it dates back to the 9/11 days when, there was a strong push to create a national identity, which is based on digital footprint. The purpose at that time was obviously different, but since then this has been in existence. And like Daniel kind of rightly laid out the evolution, it has actually changed over the years, but we are probably still not there. And I just wanted to wanted you to spend a couple of minutes to understand what are the real roadblocks and challenges, specifically in the context of the European and the UK markets, to move from the traditional modes of identity verification to a true digital identity where you try to combine both public and private data sources. And obviously it is not the responsibility of one particular set of stakeholders like a regulator or a bank. Multiple parts of the ecosystem needs to come together. The telcos need to come on board, the processors, merchants, everyone needs to come on board. How do you see this transition happening, Has it been happening satisfactorily enough? What are the challenges?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Salil, first and foremost, for inviting me, and pleasure to be here with Daniel and Ravi and all of our participants who've joined in to listen to us. And I think I'm just going to build a little bit on what Daniel and Ravi said in answer to your question. We talked about the traditional ways of doing things. We tap into a bureau, we tap into bank data, and we look at the PI data that we collect from a consumer, and we say, does this correspond to a real human in the ecosystem? Even as that's evolved into the modern, so-called modern ways of identity verification, there's been quite a heavy reliance on, for example, document-based verification using mobile phones. The problem with all of these methods are sort of what you've alluded to. First and foremost, it's not always real time, especially when you're tapping into bureau data. It takes a while for information to permeate through the system. So financial inclusion becomes a problem. And I use my own daughter as a prime example. She was a teenager. She's had a phone since she was 11 years old, but she's still, at the age of 16, doesn't have a credit card. So she's probably not someone you'll find in your traditional data sources that you typically tapped into to verify consumer identity. But if you were to start to look at alternate data sources, using the modern methods that Ravi alluded to, we all have a phone. There's a one-to-one correlation between a person and a phone number these days. Mobile phones have pretty much become the standard across the globe. People don't have bank accounts, they don't have cards, but they still have mobile phones. So why not use that information to verify identities of consumers? It's real time. It's easily tapped into, especially in parts of the globe like Europe, where there's very rich data that can be sourced from the telco networks and data sources. And this is where Prove has focused our efforts is, okay, how do we take away the need to collect national ID numbers and documents? And how do we instead go to a method where phone numbers is something a consumer is more easily able to provide, and use that as a proxy for identity verification. Do it in real time, do it friction-free. So when you tap into these data sources, yes, you're verifying that Nash lives at 123 Main Street, and he's this date of birth might correspond to Nash, but you're also at the same time verifying things that Ravi alluded to, things like tenure of the phone. How long has Nash owned this phone number? Has there been a recent event like a SIM swap or a number port that has compromised this channel? And when you do that, you're essentially securing the channel that you're then going to use to perform that multi-factor authentication, that out-of-band authentication. That security is really important because, like you've talked about synthetic IDs, first thing a person does when you're creating a synthetic ID is to make sure that you ultimately insert or inject an out-of-band channel that comes back to you, not the victim. So as a perpetrator, I'll inject my own phone number, my own email address. And so it's important to secure that channel that you're then going to perform that out-of-band authentication with. So our trust score, the product that Prove provides, looks at things like SIM swaps and call forwarding and port number porting. All are really important risk indicators of how secure is this channel. And then once you've secured that channel, and all of this is in real time, sub-second, friction-free, there's no consumer interaction here. You verify ownership of the phone, you verify data corresponding to the individual, you verify that the channel is secure, then you move into the out-of-band process where you're able to do things like confirm possession check of that channel. Now, traditionally, this has been done with OTPs. In today's world, you can do it with more modern ways that are completely friction-free. Daniel talked about the passive or completely silent mobile auth product that Prove offers that confirms phone in possession without the consumer ever having to touch the process or even enter an OTP into the process, which is just a clean, seamless user experience. If you look at Europe, some of this has been accelerated in a forced way. You've got things or regulations like PSD2, which bring about strong customer authentication as a need. You've got GDPR that places a heavy dependency on making sure that PII data is protected and shared in a responsible way with consumer consent. So it's really important that these regulations that are driving some of this change, that companies are able to adapt, and by using these alternate data sources and these friction-free methods, but that are smart, modern, and easily available, that is the path that we at Prove believe is the future of identity verification, so to speak. So.
Right. Yeah. And so I think the relevance, I have a comment here from one of the attendees. So the relevance is not only in financial services, although, we are just discussing things which are sensitive on the financial services side, specifically on payments. So the comment is around, how well this can actually be leveraged for something like voting. And, the question is, how do you implement a reliable voting system with this identity verification or digital identity? And how can it help, preventing elections getting compromised? What is the relevance and maximum reliability? So yeah, this is strictly not a financial services topic, and I'm not sure, Nash, if you have an opinion on this. It's an interesting topic because there have been different ways in which this has been attempted. Before I just leave it to you to respond on it, I know that there have been attempts to use blockchain to take care of this issue, because at the end of the day, it's all about identifying and trust associated with a person's identity, and blockchain has been the go-to solution for this. It's not been implemented in different parts of the world, in many parts of the world, yet, but there's been attempts to really use blockchain to implement a secure voting mechanism. But having said that, I think what we are discussing now, again, goes down as a fairly good solution to implement in this context, isn't it? Even for something like voting.
Personally, I think so. The question is a really interesting one, and one that we faced here in the U.S. recently, right? All these questions about voter fraud. Certainly, in many parts of the globe, it's the same concern. And I kind of keep coming back to, yes, there's potentially ways of doing things like blockchain, federated identity verification, even in certain countries where central government-owned systems are more ubiquitous. But all of these require a massive amount of upfront setup. Instead, if you were to also think about, kind of coming back to phones as a token or a proxy for a person's identity, and confirm with using a very strong authentication process that this phone number belongs to this individual and this individual has voted or not voted, you right there have an extremely amazing way of making sure that the person that is supposed to be the voter is indeed the person that is voting, by virtue of the fact that you've confirmed phone ownership straight from telcos or from a very reliable waterfall of data sources. And then the second thing is you can also confirm that the person is not coming back into the system after they've already voted. But it's a very simple way of doing identity verification, and yet has the same or similar strengths that you would expect from a federated system or from a blockchain. And it doesn't require elaborate setup. It doesn't require, it doesn't have a huge infrastructure cost. It's something that you can implement across any economy, any country across the globe.
Right. Okay, Daniel, let me come to you. The question is, we've had identity verification, obviously, in different forms payments authentication, fraud management associated with a payments cycle end to end. If you look at it, all this has been around in banks for a while now, including MFA. But should banks approach identity verification differently in the context of strong customer authentication? And if so, how do they sort of derive some kind of a strategic value out of whatever incremental changes they are doing with respect to their identity verification infrastructure, which is going beyond SCA compliance? Because there's a lot of money that is being pumped in, to be fair, by different stakeholders trying to comply with PSD2. How can they actually make it, how can they derive strategic value out of it? And what's different really in terms of SCA related identity verification?
Yeah, it's interesting. For all your feelings on PSD2, to me, at least the one good thing about it is it really puts to rest the idea of there's a silver bullet out there, right? There's 2 factors required, et cetera. It's really, it's based off some good best practices. Again, things like 2 factors required, adjusted requirements based on the relative riskiness of the transaction. All those things are best practices, and it's really best practices, not saying there's a silver bullet out there, but that you have to use things together. So from that aspect, as a practitioner, I don't dislike, PSD2 from that aspect of it. The challenge, I think, around PSD2 is really that it's this fight between 3 different things. It's the fight between that SCA and those best practices versus a cardholder experience and what they go through versus kind of access to technologies to all cardholders and all of your population, right? And frankly, that's similar to voting. When this voting question came up, that's one of the things that kind of came to mind for me. And so really the only way that I think you can handle the kind of the battle of those 3 is really making sure that you can layer and orchestrate different customer journeys appropriately. And so the idea behind that is, a login journey for your customer has to be different than a payment journey for your customer. And you have to be able to adjust based on those things. And a browser journey, has to be different than a mobile journey for your customers. And, and ultimately, right, all those things start to make up access to, virtually 100% of your cardholders or of your customers. And so you have to have that layering effect. You have to have that flexibility to be able to do that. And frankly, that leads right into the second part of your question, which kind of talks about, well, should we have been doing this anyways, right? And I think the answer is yes. We should have been doing this anyways. And what we found, frankly, in talking to our clients is that most of the time, it's not that they were doing some other best practice 2-factor a slightly different way than PSD2 mandates. It's frankly that they were probably doing less, and now they have to bump it up. So again, should we have been doing this? Probably yes. Now, so the interesting thing to me is that why not? And I think my opinion on this is really around the idea of that silver bullet, which is why I brought it up. I think a lot of people were looking for, can I do one thing to kind of solve my problems? And I think that, a one thing doesn't have a really great ROI necessarily, because it doesn't work, login versus money transfer versus a payment versus all those things. There's just no way to have one thing that solves all that. Now, what I've seen in talking with clients of ours is that if you can adjust your approach based on the user journey, so you have a different, you log in at one strength, money transfer at another strength, and then adjust that based on, a bunch of other things, right? How what's the depth and breadth of your interactions with this this identity, right? If you've seen this identity multiple times in a certain pattern over and over again, and you've been seeing this same customer for years and years and years with the same pattern, you can feel a lot better about that, right? And that way you can kind of scale down your your efforts there, and that's what helps make that ROI work, is when you have that layering approach to take really the best options in there. And so, which is interesting, because at some point in time, you're not going to have a great option for some of your cardholder base, right? There's some cardholder bases that your only option is going to be one-time passcode, or your only option is going to be something over the phone, and that's fine. You just want to make sure that's kind of as small as possible, right? You just want to run that through a funnel as much as you can. Which is what kind of occurred to me when the question on voting came up, right? Which is, there's a great opportunity there to kind of get a whole swath of a citizen base through voting, and in a nice protected way. But there's always going to be that kind of, that last 5%, that last 1% that you've got to have some kind of manual way to go about doing it. And so that's the one that seems to be the thing that really is challenging to me about that. And that leads actually to the maybe to the last part of your question, which also is, I think a lot of times we think about these in these kind of digital interactions, and one thing to don't forget about are call centers, right? So basically, PSD2 doesn't really mandate call center interactions, over the phone, and so what we've seen, frankly, in the past couple of years is this is a really big cycle back to call centers being some of the weak points, right? And I don't know, about 10 years ago, it was always, the call center was always the place that the fraudsters went to and kind of social engineered their way through. And that kind of tightened up, and the kind of the online interactions were the weak place. And now I think to some extent, and maybe PSD2 is helping this, those online interactions are tightening up. And so now the call center seems to be the weak point again. So, what's old is new again. And that's another area that you have to make sure it's not called out by regulation, but it's something that a best practice, you have to have. And we've seen some really strong ROI cases for protecting up the call center. So I think that's something to consider.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think the interest of the, it would be sort of, important for organizations to look at where else this can actually be taken to as a horizontal. So we look at it as a horizontal solution rather than something which is sort of vertical that solves only a particular problem around, card payments or online payments. Ravi, coming to you, like Daniel mentioned, one of the three things that is a balancing act when it comes to SEA is cardholder experience. And there's generally a lot of apprehension around the fact that SEA can actually lead to abandonment. And then if you try to reinforce verification, as we've been talking so far, will that end up complicating the transaction cycle further from an experience standpoint? And if that's not true, then how can it actually help in improving the overall customer experience and lower SEA scrutiny? Because eventually the objective of banks is to, over a period of time, maybe 6 months from now, 12 months from now, end up with lesser instances of fraud so that they can increase their SEA threshold and bypass several of these SEA checks. So how is it really a barrier to good customer experience, reinforcing security, or is it really the other way around?
Great question, Salil. So, just carrying over from what Daniel was saying, today, customer nowadays expect an excellent digital experience, which is driving organizations to give, the omni-channel customer journey. And Daniel just mentioned, online versus call center. Now the next one that's coming is RCS, which is you go online and you start chatting, and then, you start doing transactions with that mode as well. So, if you talk about abandonment, anytime you add more regulations, it's in many cases it's been read or understood in every which way, right? Every organization reads it with a different set of lens, and that adds more friction to the consumers, even though the objective is to give them frictionless experience. So, and I think the most important thing here is that this is which will lead to trust gap that I had mentioned earlier, right? And even if you add that tiny bit of friction, it could be as simple as saying, add a one-time passcode. That's still a friction because you're doing an online transaction. You have to look at your phone and enter it, right? Which this. Anytime you introduce something in the middle, which everybody expects that will lead to abandonment, I tend to think a little bit different because sometimes abandonment may not be really a bad thing because it may lead to reduction in fraud as well, right? Because now you're adding more and more scrutiny to the transactions and to the interactions, and you're actually giving consumers a sense of trust at that point, saying that I'm making sure that your information is protected, right? And in many such cases where you add frictionless versus frictionful, like you said, there is a good balancing act. And if we read in more detail, what SCA is asking is actually bare minimum, which is what like Daniel said earlier, that the banks and then the majority of the institutions were not really doing enough. Especially in e-commerce. So I think SCA is really a very, very good approach, and SCA PSD2, if we read through the compliance and then the objectives that it's trying to address, it's really to enable trust, right? And once you enable trust, many of the other things follow. And what I would really say right here would be that at Prove, we are really on a journey to enable PSD2 and SCA solutions by really helping to provide information around easier identification of identity per se, right? So that the faster that I can get to Ravi, the faster I can service Ravi, and hence reduce abandonment. And I think I personally believe, and Nash and Daniel kind of chimed in there. Phone number is you can say that it's becoming like a national ID, but I think it's a very good medium to connect offline and online identity, which kind of enables the trust aspect of it. And also, if you look at the various ways of implementing SCA says you have to do multiple factors of authentication. That doesn't mean that you have to do it every time. There are many creative ways and modernized ways of doing things which will enable the frictionless experience. And like the solutions that we provide, such as mobile auth, that even though you are checking for the phone number, but it's done in a frictionless way. And then our Trust Score product puts a layer of a reputation factor on top of the interaction that tells you that this is really Ravi, and you should trust this transaction to go quicker, faster. So the last thing that I would say is that phone number has the power to enable modernized solution. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Nash, we've probably got just about 3 or 4 minutes before we end. So let me come to you asking, what every organization would want to know, especially, the smaller organizations which don't necessarily have a very, very long-term viewpoint around this. What does the transition look like? Because obviously banks, in one way or the other, they are mandated to have some kind of fraud checking systems, identity verification systems in place. And now this is something new that has been brought in. It is quite likely that a lot of banks have already tried to do something around what they already have and extend it to meet compliance. But if we were to really do it well, is that very disruptive? Or what does the transition look like for an organization? Or is it more like a bolt on top of what they already have?
Yeah, honestly, that's a great question. And I don't personally believe that it has to be disruptive to your entire ecosystem. There's this modern approach, so to speak, of identity verification requires a bit of rethinking of both the front-end user experience and the UX components, but also the back-end services that you utilize, the data sources that you tap into, and how you go about reserving the more friction-filled methods, like perhaps a document-based verification, for only those extremely high-risk situations or a very small segment of consumers where you can't verify them via any other means. For the vast majority of your consumers, replacing your current methods like KBA or like a bureau-based verification, it's fairly easy to evolve that to a phone-based verification. Ultimately, the whole point is not introducing more customer interaction, but taking away the need for a lot of this customer interaction. So I believe that there's a fairly easy way and a simple way to phase these things in. In Prove, we have solutions that we structured in a very modular fashion. So you can call all of our services, web services, independently of each other, or you can orchestrate them in tandem with each other to form end-to-end solutions for onboarding, repeat consumer authentication. And that's the whole point of keeping these modular is for that reason. You know, you can look across your enterprise, whether it's the web channel, the mobile channel, the call center channel, and start to look at pieces of that ecosystem that aren't working. There's large consumer drop-off, high friction, large amounts of fraud, and you can start to focus on those pieces first. Right. And start to replace them with Proof solutions that take away the pain points. And then you start to look across the enterprise and say, how do I scale this such that it's the same services that service all of my verticals? And honestly, it is an exercise. I'm not going to lie about it. You know, there's a methodical process and approach that one needs to take to do this well. But you know, that's why we're here as experts that have done this again and again for a lot of enterprises across the globe. We can certainly tailor and make the solutions work for any company out there.
Wonderful. I'm afraid we have run out of time. We have a few more questions that have come in, but I'm afraid we can't take that up online. But what we'll definitely do is try and send a written reply to everyone. If you have any additional questions or feedback about this webinar, please do write to us at innercircle@gomedici.com. Daniel, Nash, and Ravi, thank you very much for making your presence really felt over here. You know, like I said, this has been a series of 3 webinars, and to all the listeners and the attendees, you know, these webinars, all the 3 of them will be available on demand very soon. They will be published. So it's a series around strong customer authentication and PSD2 and modern ways of authenticating. So that would be a good one for everyone to look at. Once again, on behalf of Medici and Proof, I would like to thank all the attendees today, specifically all the speakers, for your insights and inspiration. Stay healthy, stay safe, and thank you very much for joining us.